Hi again, welcome to the second video for the third SAC that will happen in week 7 for Year 12 Psych. So you would have watched the first video last week on abnormality and diagnosis and the DSM and the ICD, and this is the second video that will also be assessed in week 7. So we're starting to look at wellbeing and stress. Okay, so we kind of touched on this in class this week, the biopsychosocial model. Basically, it's the idea that psychologists, psychiatrists or doctors can generally approach someone using this model. So they can assess someone using this model, but they can also treat someone using this model. And of course, it just outlines the biological aspects of someone's health and well-being, the psychological aspects of someone's health and well-being, and the social aspects of someone's health and well-being. So biological factors include anything physical that happens to the body, so the processes, the genetics, the physiology of the body. Psychological factors are personalities, behaviours, thoughts and feelings. And the social factors are all the other things in our life, the context of our life. So school, work, friends, family, those type of things make up the social factors within our life. And like I said, this can be looked at in terms of perhaps the factors that might cause a particular illness, but also the management of this illness should be approached using this exact same model. Prior to this, that most doctors used to work on a biomedical model, which basically just used to look at individuals from a physiological point of view. So you'd walk in with a cold and you'd get treated for that cold, and that would be it. Whereas nowadays you'd walk in with a cold, but you would hope that the doctor would think about and talk to you about why perhaps you've got that cold and what's going on in life and how you can manage those other psychosocial issues. So it's just a holistic approach. Okay, we're going to move into stress, and you definitely need to know that definition of stress. So it's a physiological and psychological response. This just means that physical things happens to our body, but also our thoughts, feelings and behaviours change as well. And it can be a response to either internal or external sources of tension. So internal, your own thoughts and feelings, but external thoughts and feelings of others. It could be a physical pressure from the outside. So for instance, literally someone, squashing you is an external source of tension. So it can be both internal and external. But basically that last part that challenges a person's ability to cope is really important, because what challenges your ability to cope will be very different to what challenges my ability to cope. And this basically means that stress is very individual. We can't label one event as stressful because it won't be stressful to all individuals that go through that same event. We'll watch a video in class about stress and how we approach stress, and we'll have some really good chats about whether stress is just a perception and how you can change your outlook on stress. When someone is stressed, there is definitely a physiological arousal that goes along with that, and we know that emotional tension as well causes changes in their thinking and behaviours. But for now, we're going to really look at the physiological part of stress, so which is really the fight or flight response, which we've touched on in the past. Before we do that, quickly in psych, we talk about two different types of stress, eustress and distress. So eustress is a positive psychological response to a perceived stressor. So for instance, if you're about to be in a grand final and you're excited, that would be a positive psychological response, but it's still stressful, even though it's positive. Distress is when there's a negative psychological response to the stressor. So perhaps if you've got that grand final, but you're feeling so ill because you're so nervous, then it might be quite a distressing event for you. So one event could be a eustress for one person or a de-stress for another. Basically, regardless of whether it's positive or negative, both of them are going to initiate some sort of physiological response. Your autonomic nervous system will be activated, and we know this is then going to cause you to have the fight or flight response. In particular, the sympathetic nervous system will activate this. Now, you've already learnt about the HPA axis, but we'll just do a quick review over it. We know that stress is basically interpreted in the section of the brain called the hypothalamus. So that's the part that's activated when we're quite stressed. be it positive or negative stress. This then activates the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland activates the adrenal glands down on your kidneys, and then these adrenal glands release adrenaline and cortisol. You definitely need to know that particular pathway of activation, and it's called the HPA axis, H being hypothalamus, P being pituitary gland, and A being the adrenal glands. And this is the, mechanisms responsible for activating your fight or flight response. Hans Sale did come up with a model of how we adapt to stress physiologically. So he looked at the biological processes of stress, and you do need to know about his model. So it's called the general adaptation syndrome, or sometimes called the GAS model of stress. And it's purely a biological focus in his model, and you'll see why that's really important later. He basically said that our response to stress consists of 3 stages, and it doesn't matter what stress we go through, our body will respond in the exact same way. Once your fight or flight response has been activated, you will go through these 3 stages. So you definitely need to know that graph that you see in front of you, and you need to know the shape of it. And in past exams, people have even been asked to draw it. So you can see there that resistance to stress, when you're first exposed to the stressor, is just at a moderate level, but during the shock stage, it slightly dips. During counter shock, it starts to rise, and both shock and counter shock are part of stage 1, which is called the alarm stage. During the resistance stage, your resistance to the stress continues to rise, but then about halfway through it will start to drop. And once we hit the exhaustion stage, our resistance to stress has dropped dramatically. And if you look right at the end of the exhaustion stage, we're at a much lower point than when we first were faced with the stress initially. So you have to know the 3 stages of his general adaptation syndrome. So the first one, alarm stage, like I said before, consists of 2 phases, shock and counter shock. So shock is basically your body acts as though it's injured. So it's when you're first faced with a stressor, and you get that feeling of maybe feeling faint, and this is because your body basically goes into injure mode. So your body temp drops, your blood pressure drops, and you're very vulnerable. That might only last a couple of minutes. Then you can get your head around the stressor, and basically you go into counter shock. And that's where your body increases your resistance to that stressor because the adrenaline and cortisol has started to be released. In other words, the HB axis has activated your fight or flight response. Those hormones have started to circulate around your body, and your body temperature will go back up, your blood pressure will go back up, and you'll start to feel a little bit better. If the stress was removed at that point, you wouldn't go any further in the general adaptation syndrome. If the stress stays, you would go into the resistance stage. This is the adaptive stage, and this is where the parasympathetic nervous system kind of kicks in and gets you to, start functioning at some reasonable level. But unfortunately, adrenaline and cortisol is still circulating around, and you're still prepared for action. And if you stay in this stage for a period of time, you will start to get signs of illness. If the stress is still not removed, you'll go into the exhaustion stage. And the exhaustion stage basically is, funnily enough, when you become exhausted. Your resources are depleted, and you're definitely susceptible to some really serious and sometimes life-threatening illnesses, because basically your body can't keep fighting. So the aim of anything is to make sure that you never get into that exhaustion mode. There's a few problems with Hans Sale's general adaptation syndrome model of stress and how we respond to stress. And it's the fact that he really only focuses on the biological response to stress. So nowhere in there does it talk about, in that model, does it talk about ways that you can cope with stress, your perception of stress and how that might change your body's response to it. It purely focuses on the fact that your fight or flight response is activated, adrenaline and cortisol are circulating in your body, and that ultimately these would deplete your immune system. The other thing is that he did most of his research on rats in particular, exposing them to a whole heap of stressful environments and then measuring you know, the levels of adrenaline and cortisol that were in their body, and seeing what would happen in the exhaustion phase. So, you know, most people think that humans would probably actually respond slightly differently. Okay, so that's the last video for this SAC 3, and there will be one more video for SAC 4 coming next Thursday. Stay tuned. Catch you later.